Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Alain Durand from ICANN, from the office of a CTO in the research group. So usually I say we are the good people at ICANN. So I realize that I'm in between you and your beer, because that's the last session of the day, so I'm going to make it as short as I can. Essentially, this presentation is to talk about the project that we have started. It's called ITHI, for Identifier Technology Health Indicators. And what this is about is to track over time what we call, quote unquote, the health of a system of unique identifiers that I can help to coordinate, meaning like IP addresses, numbers, protocol parameters. And those are indicators. So an indicator may be a number like 512. The number itself doesn't mean anything. But if we know that if this indicator is low, then this is good. And if this year is 512 and next year is 400, we are doing better. Now, if the year after it goes to 600, then we are not doing as well. So this is really the trend that we are trying to look at and not the actual value. One important thing is that the goal of this project is to provide data to the community. This is not for ICANN to take any action of this. So we want to give this to the community and to the people who are developing policies, either within ICANN or within the IRs or anywhere else. And they want to look at this and make whatever decision they want. Hopefully it will be data-based, data-driven decision process as opposed to the wind is blowing this way. So we have 3 branches in the project: name, numbers, and protocol parameters. If you're familiar with the INF function, that's what it is. Let's talk about the numbers first. So in the number community, the IRs are driving this process, and they have started to work on this already about a year ago, and they have developed some metrics that are now being reviewed. So there's a global consultation that has been started. It's running till, I think, the end of the year. There's a URL there, you can find the slides. I would strongly encourage you to go look at this and provide comments. I think it's really important to get some feedback from the community on what has been done. I think they have done a great job at defining all this, but feedback and participation, again, from the community is really appreciated. Now, on the namespace, we decided to look at 5 problem areas. So, health doesn't really mean anything. So we have decided to look at this as areas where we know that there might be concerns. So there are 5 of them that have been discussed all of last year. And now we are at a stage where we understand the problem space, and we are going to define metrics on how to measure this problem space. And the third step will be to find data and do the actual measurement. So the process is to, once we will have defined all those steps, will be, once we get the data, collect the data, pre-process the data, do some minimum analysis on this, meaning computing graph essentially, and publish this as raw data. We cannot publish the data source simply because it may include some PII, or it may include some data that is under contract that we are not allowed to redistribute. But maybe we can extract some aggregated information that we are allowed to redistribute, and that's what we will do. So we are not simply going to show you just a quick graph and be done. We will provide you all the data that we use to build that graph, and then you can make your own. The vehicle that we will use to publish this will be Open Data Initiative. This is another project that is en route in ICANN, and the goal is to make as much as possible of this data available to the general public. So I'm going to go rather quickly on some of those metrics. The first one is about data accuracy or data inaccuracy. So we want to look at, is the data in the WHOIS database correct or not? And we're going to use an indirect measurement because we don't have access to the actual registration data. Only the registrars know that. At ICANN, we don't. But we receive complaints at the ICANN compliance department, and we are going to measure how many of those complaints are actually real complaints and are being acted on. So it's an indirect measurement. The next one is about abuse. So we broke down abuse into 4 categories: spam, phishing, malware, and botnet, and we just had a presentation on botnet command and control. We are aggregating a number of feeds, of anti-malware feeds, things like Spam House, Serble, and a bunch of others. And essentially what we are going to do is to count how many domains are there per TLD or per registrar, and essentially show some statistics. TLD X has this size and that number of domain that are listed as phishing activities in the aggregate of those mailing list, of those domain lists, I should say. So this is still work in progress. We're trying to find some graphical representation of that and make sure the data we have is correct, because we don't want to publicly name and shame folks and then realize that our methodology is not correct. So we're trying to really make sure that we are good there. Third one is about the root. So we heard a lot about the root and the root case rollover this week. This is about the sizing of a root. We have looked at some of the traffic at the root and realized that about 75% of the traffic is for domains that don't exist. That's a lot. And if you look at the 25% that's left, most of those queries are things that should never have been sent, because we responded with a TTL, and there's no reason that half a second later the same query comes again. So if you combine all those things together, essentially we see about 2 to 5% of queries that are real queries, the others should never have been sent. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I know that if it's 5% this year and we go down to 1% or 1/10% the next year, then it means that the infrastructure has to change. That's why we want to keep tracking this. Next one is about leakage, like things that are being asked in the root that should never exist. So those are like things like corp, home, and mail that have not been delegated, but we see queries for those. The next two are about resolvers. We have had anecdotal evidence reports that a number of resolvers are not responding what they should. Sometimes they are simply sending falsified response. So you ask for something and the resolver is sending you to a competition. That's not exactly good. And we have also heard report that some service providers are redirecting or intercepting port 53 for DNS, and instead of allowing you to go use the resolver you like, sending this to their own resolver. So we have some ideas on how to measure this. Those two metrics are still work in progress, and we'd like to work with the community on how to further refine that. The next one is about protocol parameters. This is about the registered parameters of a DNS. So for example, things like RR type, we have A, quad A, MX, NS, etc. And the basic thing we like to do is to understand how much of those protocol parameters being used. How many queries are for A versus for quad A versus for MX. It's also encompasses the list of DNSSEC security algorithm and a bunch of other things. So we have done some studies at the root, because that's where we have some data. And we found some interesting findings there. What I'm here for is to ask people who are operating recursive resolvers, open recursive resolvers or private recursive resolvers, who would like to collaborate with us and collect this data. We don't want to have, at this point, access to your raw resolver data. What we want simply is to run a script on this and count, like how many are for A, how many are for quad A, etc. In particular, the one some of us are very interested into are for TLSA. Those new systems. If we look at the root, we don't see much activity. But the root doesn't see all the traffic, so looking at it from another vantage point, especially the recursive resolver, should give us a better visibility on this. So if you would like to participate in this, please come talk to me. And yeah, well, I made it under 10 minutes, so I can save you some time for your beer. But if you have any questions, I would like to have some conversation, I'm here. Thank you.
Kevin Bloomberg, no affiliation. I have two questions, but I'll start with one and let my esteemed colleague go to number two. Going back to what you said about the spam and malware detection that you're doing, pulling in malware feeds, etc. One domain that is being used 100 million times is far more dangerous than 100 million domains being used once. Or they're the same, but it's proportional. Are you planning to use the data from the roots as well to correlate that data to what you're seeing on the malware lists in terms of intensity?
So that's an interesting question. Yeah, that's something we can look at.
Thank you,
And then you have another question, I think you said.
well, yeah, let my colleague go.
Okay.
Matt Petak, Yahoo. Just to clarify at the start, you're basically saying you've got a group where you want to collect a bunch of data. You have really no particular target for the data, no metrics associated with it. You're just going to collect data, present to the community, and then say, does this look good or bad? I'm a little curious, what is your desired outcome from this data collection project?
So let me go back to my first slide. This project started by one day my boss coming to me and saying, how do we know if we are doing a better job this year at managing the space of unique identifier than we did last year? And I said, let me think. After 5 seconds or 10 seconds, I said, well, we first need to establish a baseline and then compare what we do this year to the baseline.
So if you establish the baseline this year is 7, and then next year you come back and you say, it's 6, is it better? Is it worse? Do we have any idea of what good is, what bad is? Just generating numbers, I'm trying to understand.
That's why we started by defining the problems, right? So we look at the problems, and there's actually a much larger document that I didn't present today that goes into the details about what are those problems. And now we say, okay, those are situations that we don't like. We really don't like those. Then next step, we define those metrics. For example, here, the number of fish. So we know that fishing is really bad. Now, if your number of fish essentially goes from 7 to 6, I will argue it's better.
I think this actually ties somewhat to Kevin's point, which is if year 1, we have 100 million domains that have one query, and we say, okay, we got a baseline, and next year we say, awesome, we've improved. There's only one domain that's abusive, but it's being hammered 100 million times. We see change, and we can plot the change, but we have no idea if it's better or worse. So I think part of your project needs to talk about how do we define improvement. I'll let you jump in here.
Warren, please.
So kind of responding to Kevin and Matt. So yes, I agree with you, but currently there's no data. And the sort of ICANN community kept saying there should be data, let's collect some. Maybe this isn't the world's best data, but it's a darn sight better than nothing at all. Right? Going from 7 to 6 doesn't necessarily show much, but it's better than going, oh, what we got now. And yeah, I mean, is it definitely worse or better that there's one domain that does 1 million bad things than 1 million domains doing one bad thing? Potentially not, because right, I can change a reputation score for the one who's doing 1 million bad things. So like, at least we'll have some numbers. Like, yeah. And I mean, I should point out, when this initially happened, I came out and I was like, this is a really stupid idea and a waste of time. Having looked more, I think, it's a lot better than it was. I think this is a useful project now. And, I wanted to kind of apologize for crapping on it before from so high.
Thank you, Warren.
Speaker, could you please identify yourself, by the way?
Question in the back?
Hi, thanks for John O'Brien from the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks for briefing us on this. It looks really promising, and it calls to mind a lot of other kinds of data that I'm aware of. There's the project to measure adoption of EDNS. There's a GitHub repo that has all the sort of broken things that some DNS implementers do. There's all the cruft I see in my own logs. But it sort of prompts me to wonder, you said you're not going to sort of use this data to take action directly. What are the sort of levers that you hope this will enable? How can we expect to see this sort of have effect on the world.
So let me give you an hypothetical example, okay? It's not a real example, it's an hypothetical example. Work for ICANN, I have to be careful to what I'm using. Let's say that we look at some of this data on phishing. And we correlate this data, or somebody else, I'm not going to do that, but somebody else, maybe you, will correlate the time series relative to phishing with another time series relative to prices of domain. And hypothetically, we discover that there might be a correlation between the two. Maybe after the series of hypothetical, there might be a discussion in the policy realm about what should we do about those pricing campaigns if they are found to be the root cause of a problem. That's one example of what could happen. Of course, any resemblance to reality is pure fiction here.
Yep.
Kevin Bloomberg, I'd suggest the answer to that solution is always lower the prices, but that's just me. In regards to my second question, we've got an interesting situation in the last week, which is the KSK route, I guess you could say, change failure. Thankfully, it didn't fail on live because we failed it by not doing it now and postponed it, which is good. It was absolutely the right thing to do. On your original slide, you said that we are not going to use this data, we're going to give out this data. But here's an interesting scenario where the timeline for the rollover is ICANN's responsibility, and the risk of a failure in there. So you could measure the failure, and you could have, M12.8 for KSK rollover. But at the end of the day, the failure of that rollover comes back to ICANN, and not only affects the community, but ICANN is ultimately responsible for the failure of that rollover. Is that the kind of data that ICANN would use instead of saying we're just giving it out to the community to decide?
So in that particular case, what I could imagine in a future where we do KSK rollover number 5 or whatever it is, that we will have collected this data for a while, and then there will be some kind of a community-based process to look at this data and then define a threshold and says, if we are below that threshold, we know we are safe. If we are above that threshold, we know we are not safe. And then ICANN could use this threshold defined by the community to say, okay, we have to scrub the KSK rollover, or no, we can go ahead, this is green light.
Thank you.
Well, still have 15 minutes left, so thank you all very much.
Thank you.